30 trillion miles. 30 trillion miles. That's the average distance between two stars in our galaxy. Now, I know that when we get into numbers in the millions and billions and trillions, it's real easy just to kind of lump them together and we lose sight of the significance of this distance. So I thought an illustration would be helpful. If we could scale down miles and maybe make it millimeters, maybe I can put it in perspective, okay? So a millimeter, it's a tiny fraction of distance. It's about the thickness of a dime, okay, if you want to think of it that way. 1,000,000 millimeters would be about the distance from here to Anacortes High School. It's about 2/3 of a mile. 1,000,000,000 millimeters would be from here to just a little bit past Boise, Idaho, about 600 miles. 1,000,000,000,000 millimeters would have you traveling around the world 25 times. The distance between two stars in our galaxy is 30 trillion miles. And that's two stars amongst hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy, which is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe. Let me see if I can even put it into more perspective. It's been estimated the number of stars in the universe is comparable to the number of sand grains in all the beaches in all the world. So if you were right now to be able to jump into a spaceship and travel about 5 miles per second, I mean, that's pretty fast. It would take you 200,000 years to travel from one grain of sand to the other. Are you starting to feel small? The sheer magnitude of our universe, it's mysterious, it's awe-inspiring. Let's be honest, it's a little bit terrifying. And I think it's meant to inspire all these emotions because you see, Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the works of his hands." And it's in the universe that we see God's power. We see his intelligence. We see his complexity and his beauty. We see his creative personality. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us. Romans 1 tells us you can learn a lot about God by looking through his creation. I mean, we live in a time where we know more about the universe and the world we live in than any other generation before us. Advancements in modern science, they've given us tremendous insight into creation, from gazing through the telescope to looking through the microscope. Our generation has the incredible privilege of having a firsthand view into the majesty of God's art. You want to look at it that way? I mean, just think about it for a moment. Right now, hurtling billions of miles away in deep space are sophisticated satellites that are taking stunning images of the great unknown, and in a matter of minutes, they are sending them back to Earth for us to marvel at. Or what about this? We've seen the language of God, the universal code that is imprinted on every single cell of every living thing. I mean, we've deciphered God's language of life, the human genome, DNA, the stuff that's inside you and me. It's microscopic, 3.2 billion letter code that if you were to read it at a rate of 3 letters per second would take you 31 years to go through. And that's reading it day and night continually. If that doesn't inspire wonder for your soul as to the marvelousness of God, I don't know what will. And how do we discover these things? It's through the process of science. I mean, with this knowledge, you would think that science and faith in God, they would be like close allies that complement each other. However, we live in a world where it seems like the division between science and faith is at an all-time high. I mean, you have anti-religious scientists who consider, Christians to be backward and ignorant. You have very zealous Christians at times that talk about science as being untrustworthy, maybe even borderline evil. Seems like the divide's at an all-time high. I mean, even within the church, topics of science seem to divide those of us that they're supposed to be unified. And so is it any wonder that if you were to ask the average person on the street, or even the person sitting in the sanctuary, what is the relationship between science and belief in God, they would say that the two are enemies at war. And so that's the question that I want to pose to you today is this true? Is religious faith and science at war with one another? You see, several questions we receive would fall under this umbrella as far as what relationship or what should the relationship look like between science and God. And so in attempting to address this question, I only have an hour and a half. And so some of your eyes got really big. I got about 45 minutes if I'm lucky. I can't get everything in, but I really want to talk about two issues. The first one is a topic that I think divides us within the church quite often. And this is the issue of the age of the earth and how to interpret Genesis. Now, I liked this question. This question was given to us. It was short and sweet. It was to the point. Young earth or old earth? Question mark. All right? That's what they wanted to know. I mean, is there any other topic that's caused more division and discord? I mean, this seems to be not only the biggest point of contention between the scientific community and the church, it's also the biggest point of contention, I think, between the church and itself. The fact that most of the debate on these matters produces more heat than it does light has not helped alleviate this false perception that a lot of people possess is you got to choose one or the other, either faith in science or faith in God. In my time of teaching high school students that I encountered, over and over and over again, I would find students that were experiencing like deep anguish at this idea of how to reconcile what they were being told they had to believe in Genesis with what they were hearing in the idea of science and what science was telling them. And the reason I tell you this is because it will help you understand the approach I'm going to take for this issue. You see, it may disappoint some of you, but I'm not going to give you my personal opinion. I have one, I'm just not giving it to you. I don't know if it's right. Instead, I just really want to do two simple things. I want to lay out an overview of the issue and kind of give you the different opinions, at least the main skeleton of opinions. And then I want to just talk more about a significant issue of kind of the destructive consequences we see with sometimes the way we handle these issues. Now, the question of the age of the earth and how Genesis should be interpreted, it's a complicated question, I think. You know, because Genesis 1 through 3, it has some really unique features. Now, we've been fortunate that we've been able to go through Genesis already. And honestly, when I was looking at coming here and trying to make a decision on that, you guys were going through Genesis. And this was kind of the litmus test for me. I was like, okay, I can really figure out what this church is about by the way that they handle this topic. And I can say that I couldn't have asked for more. That maybe was the deciding factor in me pursuing this church. Because, you see, this is such a divisive issue, and yet it was handled in a way that you guys have the benefit that a lot of people don't have in the fact that you've studied Genesis in a really thorough and in-depth way. And you understand that Genesis, it's unique, and because it has these, it's like it's describing historical events, but it's doing it in a way that includes some poetic elements and some figurative elements to it. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out, okay, what is really going on here? How should we interpret this? And there's really three categories. There's a lot of different views. I want to just spell that out right away. I mean, there's a spectrum of you can land, and there's all sorts of ideas, but really you can place all of those views into one of three categories. So the first category is what's called the young earth category. And again, I'm just going to very briefly just spell these out for you so you kind of understand. Now, the young earth category, it would look at Genesis 1 through 3, and it would say it's a very straightforward, literal reading of the text. And day means day, and this is exactly what it means. And so by that view, the earth is approximately 6,000 years old. That's the young earth view, okay? And it's got a lot of merit to it. Now, there's a second view that's called the old earth view. And the old earth view is similar in a lot of ways to the young earth view, except for one big difference. And they would really say, okay, well, the word day in Hebrew is yom. And there are times where it can mean an indefinite period of time. Sometimes it means 12 hours, sometimes it's 24 hours, sometimes it's really long stretches of time. And you see it used differently throughout Scripture. And so they would say, okay, it's still a literal account, But there's just, those days are really long stretches of time. And it's by doing that, you can reconcile what modern science is telling us about the age of the earth. They said the age of the earth is billions of years old. Again, there's merit to it. And then there's a third view. It's not as understood. And so I'm going to maybe spend just a second more explaining it. It's called theistic evolution. And sometimes it's referred to as evolutionary creationism. And this view believes that God used maybe various forms of macroevolution to accomplish his purposes. Now, this is different than just Darwinian evolution, which says that there was no cause to the evolution. It just happened. You see, theistic evolution would say that God is the one that utilized it. And there's a spectrum of views on this as far as when God intervened or whether he intervened at all. And so you can look at it from different standpoints, but really the way that this view would interpret Genesis 1 through 3 is they would say that God accommodated ancient societies' limited scientific knowledge as well as maybe their misunderstandings of the world. And they did have misunderstandings of how the world worked. If you could think of it like this. Imagine trying to explain a cell phone to someone that lived 100 years ago. Now, take that back. Imagine trying to explain the concept of a cell phone to someone that lived 4,000 years ago, okay? There would be a huge disconnect there. And so this idea says that, okay, so God, there's such a huge disconnect with what happened at creation and everything that was involved, that God had to accommodate them and explain things to them in ways that they would understand it, almost like we would explain to our kids things like the birds and the bees and stuff like that, right? And so by looking at this, the message didn't want to get lost in translation, and so God is giving his most important theological points in a way that they're going to remember it. It's not really communicating strict history or strict science, but more creation as a whole. And that's what this view would believe. Again, there's merits to it. So which one is right? I don't know. You're looking at me like, what? You're ready to hear? I have no clue. What I do know is the dialogue that comes from people who take this radical stance on these matters a lot of times can be toxic and destructive. And so what I want to offer to you is just a couple of observations and then just a really quick piece of advice, okay? And you can take it or leave it if you'd like. So the first observation, I know personally people that are very intelligent. They love the Word of God. They take it seriously. They are passionate about Jesus, that would fall into all three of these camps. Right away, that should tell you that maybe this is not as clear-cut as we think. The second observation, and it may seem kind of obvious, but we weren't there. So we don't really know what happened. And I would be a little bit leery of anybody that said that they knew without a shadow of a doubt how it worked, okay? And so here's my advice. I think it's best to proceed with humility. I think it's best to go into it with a humble spirit, willing to listen and dialogue with people. These topics are important. I'm not saying they're not. I think we should study them. I think we should pursue them. I think we should talk about them. But at the end of the day, they're not essential. These topics are not going to decide whether someone has a personal relationship with God or not. These topics don't decide the condition of a person's heart. And so, again, pursue them, study them, talk about them. I think that we should. Let's just don't make too much of them. And the final point on that is, I would encourage you, what I see a lot of times as I talk about this issue and listen to people about this issue is people really kind of like to latch on to what they believe. And so they may study what they believe quite a bit, but they don't really consider the other viewpoints or even know them. And so I would encourage you to study all the different viewpoints, even the ones you disagree with. And then the second part of that is, I would really encourage you to dialogue with people that disagree with you. Because you see, we live in a very much victim-based society. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. We live in a culture that if you disagree with me, then you hate me, and I'm not going to listen to you. Are we modeling that in the church? Should we be modeling something different? A crazy thought, hey, that we can actually dialogue and practice listening and respecting one another and model love and actually learn from people that we don't even agree with. And so that is the challenge. It may not be what you were looking for. You may want to have heard something else, but I think that that's more important than which view is right. Plus, there's a more important question at stake. This kind of goes into our second part. You see, how old is the earth is not as important as the question is, how did the earth even get here in the first place? And that question seems to be neglected because we get distracted on the other question. And so here is the second part of what I want to talk about. We're going to kind of transition into part two. The question that we received is this: why should we believe in God if he doesn't give us any proof that he exists? That's a fair question. That's a good question. And so the way that I want to handle this, I want to maybe deviate from that for just a minute, and I want to kind of lay a foundation, just like you would lay a foundation for a house, and you don't always see the house built right away. I'm going to kind of lay the foundation to start with, but I promise you I'm getting back to the house. I just want to tell you that in advance so you know, where is he going with all this, okay? So let's lay some foundation. I just want to start by just outlining very briefly the natures of science and the nature of belief in God. Okay, so let's start with science. So to summarize the view of science or the nature of science, science is a process that involves the effort of us as humans to better understand the natural world around us. And we do that through observation, through our senses, and then we form predictions, and then we test them. I mean, essentially, that is the scientific process. And when we talk about the natural world, we're talking about like physical things. Science is a wonderful thing. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, or it's an incredible process. I mean, look at what we've accomplished through science. Antibiotics, air travel, air conditioning, okay, which is not as big of a deal up here, but go to Texas in August and you will appreciate air conditioning really quick. As Proverbs 25:2 says, it's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search them out. I can't help but think that this had science maybe in mind. Because you see, science is like this massive, amazing treasure hunt where God has put these things in creation, and we don't create them, we discover them, we uncover them. And so in that way, it's like this incredible joy as far as going and finding things and discovering things. Even there's a misnomer that talks about like all scientists are, they have no religious faith, they don't believe in God. The reality is it's about 50-50 split. About 50 people in the scientific community really believe in a personal God, the other half don't. But even the ones that don't, it's interesting to hear them how they talk about when they make discoveries or when they pursue science. They talk about it in a way that it's almost spiritual and the joy that they get out of it. And I think that's intentional. Now, let's shift gears for a minute. So we've talked about science. Let's talk about the nature of belief in God. It involves entering the world of the supernatural. That should be a clue right there, supernatural. It is outside the realm of science. See, you can't put God in a test tube. You can't study him in a lab. Matters pertaining to God and the supernatural are just that. They're outside the scope of the natural world. And so that may beg the question from some people, does this mean that science and matters related to God are opposed to each other? Not at all. Here's how I view science, and I've already talked about it a little bit. I believe that science is a gift. It's a gift from God that we can use, and we can actually use it to know him deeper. We can use it to bring him glory. However, as with many of God's gifts to us, we wind up giving them our complete devotion and worship. There's a term for that. It's called idolatry. And I think this is what occurs with science. You see, the conflict is not with science and God. The conflict is with two competing worldviews. You have one worldview called materialism. And this is, I believe, where the idolatry comes in. Materialism claims a few things. It claims science is the only way to truth. That's one claim. The universe is really all that there is. And ultimate reality is found in the material world. From this perspective, the supernatural is merely a fairy tale. That is one worldview. Now, the other worldview is known as theism, and it's quite different. It believes that ultimate reality is found in the God who created the universe, and that science is just one of many ways that we can discover truth. Okay, so let me illustrate it this way. Actually, John Lennox, he's if you haven't heard or listened to him, go listen to him. He's phenomenal. He's a Christian philosopher and mathematician at Oxford, and he illustrates it this way. I thought I'd pass it along, share. So you have a theist and a materialist that walk into a room. They see a kettle of water boiling. The materialist is asked, why do you think that the water is boiling? And he goes into a description of, well, the heat that's produced from the stove is being conducted by the copper kettle, and it's agitating the water molecules, and they're moving faster and faster, and that's what's causing the water to boil. The theist looks at him and says, well, I totally agree with that. That's true, but the reality is the water is boiling because I wanted a cup of tea. You see, the materialist only recognizes scientific explanations. The theist would say, yes, scientific explanation is true, but there are other explanations that transcend what's happening at the material level. So the question, this is where we're going to get back into how does this question pertain to God, is we need to ask the question, where does science fit into this worldview conflict? And what in the world does this have to do with God's existence? That's where we're getting to. I want to start that by saying, maybe a little bit of a disclaimer, we cannot prove God's existence. I want to say that from the start. However, we can't disprove his existence either. What we have to do is realize that both worldviews require faith, and the question we need to ask is, which worldview requires more faith? Or put another way, which one is more reasonable to believe? Now, before we get there, I think that maybe we need to clear up the idea of what faith means. Okay, so Richard Dawkins, he's a brilliant biologist, maybe the most well-known representative of atheism. I think there's a misconception here that he demonstrates well. This is his quote. I just want you to listen to it. And it says, a case can be made that faith is one of the world's greatest evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. And this is the key part. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. Did you catch that? Faith, which isn't based in evidence, that is what he considers faith. Now, I can't speak for other religions, but I know for a fact from the Christian perspective, when the Bible talks about faith, it's always based in evidence. That's really what that word implies. It's never a blind faith. And so we're actually in agreement on what faith means. Faith is simply put trust based on evidence. And so I think if we can clear up that, blockage of communication, maybe we can get somewhere in this topic. And so to say that I believe that God exists, that's a faith statement. We need to understand that. But also to say I believe the material universe is all that there is, that's also a faith statement. And so which faith statement is the most reasonable to believe? I'm going to present 3 discoveries that modern science has presented to us. And all 3 of these I feel like are very well founded. And at the end of each of these discoveries, I'm going to just ask the simple question, which worldview is more reasonable to believe? And so I invite you to reflect on that, to ponder that, to join with me in that, okay? So here's the first discovery. It deals with the presence of our universe. And we're looking at this idea of, can something come from nothing? The year was 1916. Albert Einstein was finalizing his theory of general relativity. He wasn't very happy with where the results were taking him. Because you see that the thought at that time was that the universe was eternal. But what he was finding out through his calculations was the universe actually had a starting point. There was a time and there was a place where the universe actually came into existence. There was a time where it didn't exist. Einstein described this finding as irritating. He actually fudged the numbers to make it look like the universe was still eternal, but it caught up with him because discoveries started pointing out the same thing. The biggest one was that of Edwin Hubble in 1927. And he actually put concrete observation to what was just purely theoretical at the time. He actually saw the universe expanding. Now, it's going to take a long time to really kind of explain how he did that. So you just got to trust me. You can go look it up on your own. But he saw the universe expanding. And these were like the beginning stages of what led to this thought of the Big Bang Theory. Now, when I say Big Bang Theory, okay, first of all, how many of you think of the TV show? All right, anybody that popped in their mind? That's what happened to me. Okay, so I'm not talking about the TV show. All right, how many of you have negative connotations with the Big Bang? I would, yeah, don't be afraid to raise your hand. I talk to students quite a bit. Almost the entire class raises their hand. I think there's a reason behind that. It's this idea that this theory a lot of times is packaged with an atheist worldview, and so it's given to you in a way that it's hard to decipher the science from the materialist view. It'd be like taking a really great gift, but then just doing a really crummy wrapping job with it, really disgusting, and giving it to somebody. And so let me explain what the Big Bang says. The Big Bang Theory basically states that the universe, it appears to be expanding from a very small point, and it's continuing to expand to this day. So in other words, if you were to take a video recording of the history of the universe and you were to put it in rewind, what you would see is everything coming down into this really, really tiny point of very dense, hot energy. But what it goes on to say is that in that dense, hot point, there's a point really, when it gets really, really, really small, that the laws of physics break down. That means things become absurd. We can't make predictions. We can't tell what's going on. It's the idea that there was a time where space and time itself and the material world actually popped into existence. Now, there's really kind of two ways that you can look at this. You can say, well, that sounds a lot like Genesis 1, okay? And that would require, if time and space and matter actually didn't exist at one point and then they popped into existence, then that would require something that is supernatural, that's outside of time and space and matter, to actually create it. And that's one viewpoint. The other viewpoint, the most popular materialist view, would say that there was a time where the universe created itself out of nothing. So the question here, which view is more reasonable? Now, it's at this point a lot of people might throw in the question, well, what about God? Who created God? And what I would say to that is there really has to be something that's eternal. There had to be something that was self-existent, right? Or otherwise you just have an endless string of events going back that never stopped. So something had to start it all. Something had to be eternal. And your two options are either something outside of time, space, and matter started it, or the universe itself is eternal. One of the two. And what we've just talked about is science is pointing away from the idea that the universe is eternal. So God, or not necessarily God, but something that seems to match the characteristics of how the Bible describes God would be the other alternative. And so again, which viewpoint is more reasonable? A supernatural, something outside of nature created it, or the universe created itself out of nothing? Here's the second discovery, and it deals with the nature of our world and our universe. Coincidence, a striking occurrence of two or more events at one time, apparently by mere chance. That's the definition. So have you ever experienced a crazy coincidence? Like maybe you were thinking, this happened to me the other day, I was thinking of a really obscure song I hadn't thought about in forever, and then it popped up on the radio right as I was thinking about it, and you're like, that's crazy, right? That would be a coincidence. But at what point does something move beyond the realm of coincidence to intention? Or put another way, when do we decide there's no way that a set of circumstances could have happened by crazy chance? Now, I think an illustration might be helpful here. Kelly, if you've got that picture of Mount Rushmore, let's go, and the Grand Canyon, let's go and put it up. And so I want to do just a quick exercise as far as when is it that we actually infer intelligence behind something? You see two pictures up there. Which one did you infer had an intelligent source? Mount Rushmore, right? But why is that? Well, there's a guy named William Dembski. He's a mathematician. He's written quite a bit on this. And what he says is to infer intelligence really requires two things. It requires, first of all, a highly improbable event. Okay, and we see these a lot, right? So I could take, if I had a bunch of Scrabble pieces in my pocket, I take them, I throw them up, and they land wherever. That would be a highly improbable event, because what are the chances that if I threw them up again, they would land just like that? Almost zero, right? So that would be improbable. But you don't just need something that's improbable, you need something more. Both of these are improbable. What else? You need a meaningful pattern or a meaningful outcome. You need something that's conveying what we would consider complex information. The only one of these two pictures that is displaying or demonstrating a meaningful pattern is Mount Rushmore, because we never see natural causes carving out the faces of 4 U.S. presidents, right? That never happens. And so we infer intelligence. And I want you to think about that, because as we start talking about some of these things, keep that in mind. That's going to help things. And so let's jump back into the nature of our universe. One of the striking things about our universe is that it obeys certain rules. It's a law-abiding universe. And what we mean by laws is there's a constancy in nature. It's what allows science to work. It's what allows us to make predictions. If the world just did whatever it wanted to and the universe just did whatever it wanted to, there would be no way to predict how it would act. But it's law-abiding. As really respected and renowned physicist and cosmologist Paul Davies writes, science is based on the assumption that the universe is thoroughly rational and logical at all levels. But here's the question. How did these laws of nature come to be? Everything that I've ever observed with my own senses tells me laws always come from a lawgiver. The material view would say laws exist without reason and come from a mindless universe. Now, while the origin of nature's laws is important, just as important is a question that was posed by Antony Flew. Now, Antony Flew, he died in 2010, but he was one of the greatest philosophers of our generation. He was a well-known atheist. In fact, he published some of the most compelling information and writings on atheism there is, but something happened in 2004, and it shocked the world that he actually changed his view and admitted that there was an intelligent creator, said that he believed there was an intelligent creator. Now, he never went past that, but he did make that confession. And he wrote a book, and he talked about what it was that caused him to make that journey to the other side. And this is one of the questions that he writes that was kind of the sticking point. He says, at what point, or actually, I'm sorry, he says that why are these irregularities, these laws of nature, so mathematically precise, universal, and tied together? So it's the idea that we see these laws of nature and that there's an incredible precision with them. And that they are universal. We can look throughout the universe and they're the same. And that they're tied together. They're integrated. If you mess with one, it affects all the others. You see, when astronomers consider the universe, they can imagine all sorts of different ways that it could have been. You tweak a factor here or there. You make gravity a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker. You change the rate at which the universe expanded. You make atoms, you change their size or their weight. And you change these factors, and what usually ends up happening is you come up with these really bizarro universes. Like there's no way that they can support life. And so the question, how do we explain the fact that our universe happens to have all these crazy factors that are just so precise, I mean, to the millions and trillions, that everything supports life? So I want to illustrate it this way. You're going to have to use your imagination for this, okay? One of the things that we're currently doing in science right now is in the space travel industry is we're looking to venture out, right? We're looking to go to Mars. And not just go to Mars, but actually live there and be able to inhabit it. And what that would require is what's called a biodome, okay? It's this idea, it's this area or this facility that allows for life to occur. It's sealed off from the outside hostile environmental conditions. So imagine with me, we've jumped in the future, we've gone to Mars. Right now we are in Mars and we are inside that biodome, okay? You're gonna have to picture this, help me out. And inside the biodome right now, we are sealed off from everything that's harmful, that we have life, we can sustain it here. And on the back, on this wall, you see about 35 giant dials, okay? And they have numbers, not just increments of into the hundreds, but increments into the thousands and the millions and the trillions, okay? And the funny thing is, each one of these dials is set to a very specific number. And one says the level of gravity, and the other says oxygen level, and one says carbon dioxide level, and so forth. And as the leader of the biodome, I come to you and I tell you, it's good to have you, but whatever you do, do not touch the dials. if you move the dial, just one dial, one increment to the right or one increment to the left, we are going to die. That's what we see with planet Earth. That's how precise it is. You mess with one, you mess with them all. It begs the question, which is more rational to believe, is it the idea that there was an intelligent source behind it, or that it was a mindless process? Because you see, the materialist viewpoint, it's hard to argue with this, and so they would say, yeah, this looks very precise, and so the most popular view or explanation from a materialist side of things would say, okay, well, there's a multiverse. There is a universe generator that has produced an infinite amount of universes, not just ours, and by chance, if you have an infinite number of universes, at least one or two are going to pop out to be able to support life. But there's a problem, I think, with this issue, because although you would have, this universe generator, what would it look like? It would be massive. The power of it would be comparable to maybe what the theists would consider to be the power of God. However, it would possess no intelligence. So basically, your answer to the dilemma is to propose a machine with godlike power, but no personality, no intellect, and no purposeful intention. Which is more reasonable to believe? That our finely tuned universe was created by an intelligent mind, or by a mindless, purposeless machine? Let's jump to the last thing. Okay, so we've just looked through the telescope. We've seen precision in the universe. Let's look through the microscope and see, is there evidence of an intelligence there? Carl Sagan. How many of you have heard of Carl Sagan? Okay, probably, yeah. So Carl Sagan, if you're not familiar with him, he was a brilliant astrophysicist. He was also a very big popularizer of science. He's probably most well known. He had a television series on PBS that was titled Cosmos. And on that show, he coined a signature phrase. It says, "The cosmos is all that there is, or was, or ever will be." Now, Sagan, he also contributed heavily to founding an organization called the SETI Institute. Now, the SETI Institute stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Basically, it's the Institute's listening for radio waves to see if there's intelligence out there. And he wrote a book called Contact that became a movie in 1997. Okay, I don't know if any of you have seen that or not, but it's an interesting movie. Jodie Foster plays the main character. She is an astronomer, Dr. Ellie Arroway. And in the movie, there's this scene where, that shows these massive satellites pointed up to the skies, and she hears something. And frantically, she's getting back to her base of operations to try to figure out what's going on. She has a very small team, and they start to listen for something. And I want you to watch this clip if we can pull it up. And this is just kind of setting you up for what's going to take place.
All right, it's restarting. Wait a minute. Those are numbers. That was a 3. The one before it was a 2. Base 10 numbers. Just start counting now.
That's
See how far we can get. 1. 7. Those are primes. 2, 3, 5, 7. Those are all prime numbers. And there's no way that's a natural phenomenon.
Did you catch what she said? How did she respond? So what she heard was a short string of, it was 4 prime numbers, and it was a pattern. And her comment was, there's no way that this is a natural phenomenon. It had to be an intelligence. And I would agree with that. If this really happened at SETI, they found a pattern of a string of prime numbers, I would agree there's a meaningful pattern there. There must be intelligence. But here's where I'm a little bit confused and I don't understand is, consider that, and then on the other side, consider DNA. There's no doubt that DNA functions as a language, and I'm going to give a very, very short, it's not going to even do it justice, oversimplified explanation. But basically, DNA is a 4-letter alphabet. You got the letters A, T, G, and C. And you can put these letters in different 3-letter combinations. and you can form 22 words. And those words form really, 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 really long sentences. But here's the interesting thing about DNA. Really kind of two things. DNA functions not just as straightforward sentences, it functions as a code. Now, I told you last time that I was here I created a scavenger hunt of coded clues for Sherry, and I can tell you from experience that codes are way more complex. Just writing the coded messages was really time-consuming and brutal. Codes are always more complex. But not only that, we can look at DNA, and it's a 3 billion character code that took some of the top scientists and best technology 15 years to decipher. Obviously, it's highly improbable, but is there a meaningful outcome behind it? I would say so. Because DNA, it's the instruction manual for every living thing on the planet. It's like a universal language that explains and gives instructions for how things are to be built. And so, again, we have to ask ourselves, and I invite you into the question, and you have to answer for yourself, if a short string of prime numbers is a slam dunk for an intelligent source, then what about a 3 billion character code that forms the instruction manual for life? I've given you 3 scientific discoveries. I've asked the simple question of which is more reasonable to believe, the materialist view or the theist view. I want to close with one more thought. The title of the sermon is, Can We Have Faith in God and Science? I hope we've addressed that question, at least to a degree that you've seen that. And I would say yes and no. I would say yes, we can trust the scientific process as far as it's a beautiful process. We as believers, we shouldn't be running away from it. We shouldn't be plugging up our ears and trying not to listen to it. We shouldn't be scared of what the results are, where they're going to take us. However, we need to also understand that the scientific process is limited. It's limited by us as humans who are fallible, and we need to keep that in consideration. But it's also limited on what it can answer. Because you see, science cannot answer the most meaningful questions in life. Science doesn't answer what gives life meaning, or why in the world are we here, or what our purpose is. The other thing that science can't do, it cannot offer ultimate hope. Even this week, just listening to different stories and people in my life, and life is hard. And I can't imagine, both viewpoints have to explain why that is. The materialist explanation is just the way it is. Life stinks. Get over it. The theist viewpoint, at least the Christian viewpoint, says we live in a world that was created good, but it's flawed, but there is hope. And I can go through the tough stuff knowing that there's hope for something better. And that's the invitation I give to you and to people, hopefully, that are listening that may have a different viewpoint than me, is out of the 2 viewpoints, which one would you want to have? Not just where the evidence is based, but which one actually provides hope? Let's pray. Father, we've looked at your creation, and it's awe-inspiring and terrifying. And it should lead us, hopefully, to have awe of you. But I can't help but be struck by the idea that this is the gospel that is great and is powerful and is awe-inspiring and maybe terrifying as you are. The good news is that you love us. You love us to the point of sacrifice. You sacrificed yourself for us. What good news. And I pray that would strike the hearts of each of us here. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.